In this video, you're going to learn how to beef up your app configuration. You're going to look at a better way to store local environment variables, and you'll learn how to set custom environment variables on Heroku. Because we have that secret key we use for our JWT tokens that currently is stored in the code. We want to break that out to an environment variable for our development and test environments, and we also want to set that as a production environment variable on Heroku. Now, the first thing we're going to do is tweak how we manage our local environment variables. Currently, all of those values are provided inside of config.js, and right now this isn't a big problem, but it's a really bad idea to have your config variables as part of your repository. Now, currently we just have a port and a local database URL, which means if someone gets a hold of this information, it's not a big deal. But as we start adding secrets and third-party API keys, you are going to have valuable information, and you do not want that to be added to the Git repository. Now, obviously, your repo is probably going to be private if you have secure information in it, but even then, it's just one more place this data is floating around. Now, the most important thing to remember as we go through this process is that only development and test environment variables are configured locally via some file. The production environment variables, those are always going to get configured via either the Heroku command line tools or the Heroku web application. Now, so far, we've only used port and MongoDB URI. Both of those were provided for us by Heroku, but we actually have the ability to set any environment variable we want, any key value pair. We're going to look at how to do that a little bit later. For now, let's focus on getting these environment variables outside of the config.js file. Now, the config.js file is not going to go away completely. The file is still going to exist, and it's actually still going to run on both development, test, and production, which means we're not going to be changing anything inside of the server.js file. We're still going to load this in regardless of the environment. Inside of the config.js file, though, instead of defining the environment variables for test and development, we're simply going to load them in if we're on the test or development environment. Now, to get this done, we are going to add an if statement up above. The code below will get removed a little bit later, but we are going to keep it around because we still need those values. If the environment equals development or the environment equals test. Now, previously, we did different things depending on the environment. In this case, we don't care whether it's test or development. We just want to run it if it's either. Now, inside of here, what we're going to do is load in a separate JSON file. This is where our development and test configuration variables are going to live, and that file, config.json, it is not going to be part of the Git repository. Now, that's going to be a problem on test and development if you don't have the file, but on production, where the file won't exist, it's not going to be a problem. This code's never going to run because the production environment variable will not pass this condition. Inside of here, we are going to be doing some configuration, but before we get into that, let's go ahead and set up the JSON file. We have the opportunity to set it up however we like, whatever makes sense for our application. Inside of config, we're going to make a new file called config.json, and this file is just going to be a regular JSON file. We're going to have key value pairs on the root object, where the key is the environment, example, test, and the value is an object. We're going to have one for test, and we're going to have one for development. Now, inside of these objects for development and test, we can specify any local environment variables. For example, inside of the local test environment, we have two variables. We have port and MongoDB URI. I'm going to set port inside of double quotes equal to the value 3000, and I can also set MongoDB URI equal to whatever value I had previously. Now, this is JSON, so the value, which is a string, is going to need to be wrapped in double quotes. I'm going to grab it from the config.js file and paste it into the JSON file right inside of the quotes. Now, this configures all of our test environment variables, but we do still have some development ones we want to grab. We have port, which is identical. Port gets set to 3000. We also have MongoDB URI, and that is going to get set equal to a string, and we're going to grab the value we used previously. This can get copied and pasted right into the config JSON file, and we are done. Now that we've moved all the variables over to the new JSON file, we can wipe our old if statement. I'm not going to delete it. I'm just going to comment it out so it doesn't actually run when we eventually run the program. Now, the next thing we need to do is figure out how to get these values. We need access to this object so we can properly set up process.env. Right here, for example, we set process.env.port equal to 3000. We need a system to do the exact same thing, but it needs to use this JSON file. Now, the first thing we're going to do, which is a great feature, is require the JSON file. And when you require JSON, it actually automatically parses it into a JavaScript object. We don't have to use anything like json.parse to get that done. This means we can make a variable called config, and we can set it equal to the return result from require, and we're going to require a local file, so we'll start with /. It's in the current directory, so we can simply name it config.json. I am adding the extension here because that is important. Now what we have access to is this config object. I'm going to go ahead and log it to the screen so we can see exactly what it looks like, console.log config, and we can save the file running config.js from the terminal. Now, normally we wouldn't be doing this, but we can do it in this case. I'm going to run the file in the folder server, then it's in the folder config, and the file itself is called config.js. When we run it, what do we get back? We get back our object with the test property that has port and MongoDB URI, and we have our development property with the same two environment variables set up. This means we have our object. Now we just need to figure out how to use that object to set the process.env object. The first thing we want to do is grab just the environment variables for the environment we're currently in. If env is equal to development, all we want is this object. If it's equal to test, all we want is the test variables. Right here, I'm going to create a separate variable called var env config. This is going to store just the config variables for the current environment, and I'm going to set this equal to the config object, and we're going to use bracket notation to grab the environment. I'm going to pass in the environment variable. So if env is equal to test, we're going to grab the test property. If env is equal to development, we're going to grab that development property. When you want to use a variable to access a property, you have to use bracket notation like this. Now that we have the env config variable, all we need to do is loop over it. And for each property, for example, port, we want to set that on process.env. We want to do it for everything inside of the object, which in this case is just 2. Now, the first tool we're going to use to get that done is something called object.keys. Object.keys takes an object like env config, it gets all of the keys, and it returns them as an array. We can go ahead and log this to the screen to see exactly what we get. I'm going to wrap it in parentheses, call console.log, save the file, and rerun it from the terminal. When I rerun the file from the terminal, what we see is an array where we have the port environment variable in uppercase and MongoDB URI. Now that we have this, all we need to do is loop over the array, doing something for each item. I'm going to remove the console.log call, and we're going to call for each, which, as we know, lets us loop over an array of items. It takes a callback function as its one and only argument, and that callback function gets called with each item. I'm going to call each item the key. This means that we're going to have a function which will get called with a key of port and a key of MongoDB URI. Inside of here, we can then set process.env using bracket notation key. If the key is port, we're setting the port property on env. If the key is MongoDB URI, we're setting the MongoDB URI property on env. And we're going to set that equal to whatever the value is in env config. Env config, and we're going to grab the value for the key just like this. And with this in place, we are done. We now have a much better system for managing that local configuration. I'm going to go ahead and remove the commented code, save the file, and before we do anything else, we want to ignore the config.json file via git ignore. Inside of here, currently we just ignore node modules. We're going to add a second line ignoring a file. The file is in the server directory. Then we're going to go into the config directory, and the file itself is called config.json. With this in place, the config.json file will never get added to the repository. Over in the terminal, if I run git status, you can see the new file is nowhere in sight. We have our two modified changes showing up, but we do not have that config.json file because it has been successfully ignored from the local repository. Now this was step 1, coming up with a system to manage local environment variables. This also lets us easily add a new environment variable. Right here, we're going to add one called JWT secret. If you remember, inside of the test seed file, we reference ABC123 2 times when we call JWT.sign. This is a pretty big problem, and the problem also exists inside of our model user file. Down here, we have a few calls to JWT sign and a call to JWT.verify. Both of these have the exact same string inside of them. What we need to do is, instead of having the string inside of the code, we need to pull that out into an environment variable and reference the environment variable right here and over in the seed file. Now, the first step to that is going to be to create the environment variable. Let's go ahead and make one called uppercase JWT underscore secret. And we're going to set this equal to whatever secret string we want to use. I recommend using something long and random. You do not need to use the same value. I'm going to go ahead and just press on the keyboard a little bit, coming up with a nice set of numbers and letters. I don't need to actually remember this value because it's stored as a config variable. I'm going to also do the same thing for development. Right here, I'm going to set JWT secret equal to whatever I like. And I'm going to come up with a new unique string, something slightly different, but pretty similar in terms of its randomness. Now that we have this in place, we have a JWT secret variable we can access in both the test and development environments, which means we can update the code inside of seed.js and user.js. Right here, instead of having our secret right in the code, we will reference process.env.jwt underscore secret. And we're going to do the exact same thing down below. I'm going to copy this statement, paste it right here, and we can do the same thing over inside of user.js. I'm going to save and close the seed file. Inside of user, we're going to do it for our JWT sign call. And we're also going to do it down below for the JWT verify call, which uses the same exact secret to verify a token was indeed created by who it says it was. Now that we have our user file updated, we can save it and close it. To make sure everything still works as expected with this new configuration, over inside of the terminal, I'm going to run npm test and make sure all my test cases still pass. Now everything should still pass. We have our environment variables in place. They're in place for the test environment. So as far as the tests are concerned, nothing should have changed. All we've done is changed how the environment variables get set. Over here, you can see we have 22 passing tests, which is fantastic. We can also run a quick development test by starting up the app using node server.js and running a few calls from Postman. For example, over inside of Postman, I could create a new user using the post users request. I'm going to make a new user with the email andrew9@example.com. If I send that off, I get a 200. I get my XAuth header back. I can grab that header value and try to do something like fetch my to-dos. I'm going to go ahead and fetch my to-dos. There shouldn't be any because I haven't created any. Remember, this is a private call, so we're going to add an XAuth header. We're going to paste in the value, we send it off. We get no to-dos, but that's fine. We don't have any. As long as the call was successfully authenticated, then we can be pretty sure all of our environment variables were configured properly. Now that we have our local configuration in place, it's time to talk about how we're going to configure the JWT secret variable for production. Locally, we just specify it here, but when we want to configure on Heroku, we have to do something slightly different. Over inside of the terminal, we're going to take a look at a series of Heroku commands to get the job done. Let's go ahead and clear the terminal output. And the first command we're going to run, Heroku config, is something we've already executed. We ran this previously to get the value of MongoDB URI. Here's my value. This should be the only one that shows up. Now we know there is a port environment variable configured somewhere in the app. That is a Heroku specific environment variable. You're not going to be able to update that value, so it's not visible here. Now we have one environment variable showing up, a key value pair. We can go ahead and actually set our own. To do this, we're going to run Heroku space config:set. This takes a key value pair. The key could be something like name, and the value, which comes after the equal sign, could be whatever you like. Go ahead and set your name right here. I'm going to set Andrew, then I'm going to hit enter. Now, as you can see, it's setting and restarting the application. This means that it's going to restart the app, so the app has access to the new environment variable, and we can run Heroku config again, and this time around we should see our environment variable, and we do. Sitting right here, we have name, and it's set equal to Andrew. Now, aside from viewing and setting variables, we can also go ahead and get an individual environment variables value. Heroku config.get lets us do that. All we do is specify the name of the environment variable to fetch. In this case, I could specify name, and right here you can see Andrew returns. The last command we can use to manage these environment variables is Heroku config::unset. Unset removes an environment variable. Now, we never want to unset MongoDB URI, but in this case, we could unset name. We use Heroku config onset, followed by the uppercase name environment variable. We run it. This unsets it and restarts the app. And if we run Heroku config for a final time, you can see we're right back where we started. Now that we know how to set these environment variables, all we need to do is set one called JWT secret. We're setting this to make sure our calls to JWT sign and JWT verify don't fail on production. Currently they would, because the environment variable would not be defined. Go ahead and take a quick moment to set a JWT_environment variable, set it equal to some random string, then go ahead and fetch it, making sure it was set properly. When you're done, you can go ahead and click play. All right, that one should have been pretty easy. All you had to do was run Heroku config::set to set the environment variable. We're going to create one called JWT_secret, the exact same name as the local environment variable and as the environment variable we referenced in our files. It's really important that all of these line up, otherwise the program is not going to work as expected. Now, back inside of the terminal, we can go ahead and set this equal to, using the equal sign, some sort of random string. You can go ahead and jam the keyboard for a little bit, coming up with something good. And then we can go ahead and run the command. Right here, you can see it's setting JWT secret and it's restarting the application. If I run Heroku config, we are going to see our environment variable showing up, which is fantastic. If you're seeing this here with the value you set, then you are done. With all of our config code properly working, we can go ahead and make a commit. I'm going to run git status. Here we see we have our 4 changed files, which is expected. I can then run git commit with the AM flag to leave a commit message. A good message for this one is update config to use JSON file. I'm also going to push this up to Git, and this is where we'll stop for this one. In the next video, which is the final video for this section, we're going to go ahead and get the app running on Heroku once again. Stay tuned. I will see you soon.